Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Robotina, where we're seeing that the Russians have made two small advancements in this direction, first to the northwest of Verbove and also in the south of Robotina. To the south of Robotina, we have seen further advancements in the forest line by Russian forces. The forest lines here are covered by trenches, which means that there is a trench-to-trench fighting going on between Russian and Ukrainian soldiers, which is why we're seeing this very slow advance as soldiers are facing off face-to-face. We also see that the Ukrainian positions all throughout the forest patches and the village of Robotina, as well as the trenches here to the west of Robotina, which also is separated into a Russian and Ukrainian side, as well as trenches to the north of Robotina and here to the northwest of the village. With all of these positions by the Ukrainians, the Russians are trying to push slowly through these trenches to get a better position towards Robotina, but the Ukrainians are putting up significant resistance, which is why we're seeing this very, very slow Russian advance. As for the Verbove direction, we see here that the Russians made a small advancements here as well. This is also a trench position located here to the northwest of Verbove, and with this we see that after the capture of the trenches here to the southwest of Verbove, the Russian forces captured yet another trench here to the northwest of Verbove, and with this there are no further fortifications between the first line of defense, which consists of the anti-tank ditches and Dragon Teeth, and the Ukrainian positions across them, between the Russian positions and the Ukrainian positions, unless the Ukrainians have prepared new positions or others have not been detected by satellite imagery, which if you go over the battles that actually took place, the Russians actually had very significant fortifications in this whole Robotina direction, where a lot of it was hidden from satellite view because they were built by the forest lines, and inside of them it is likely that there could still be further fortifications in this direction, but the Russians have managed to capture bit by bit. Although these are very small and slow advances, they're slowly pushing the Ukrainians across the first line of defense. We then move on in a northeastern direction towards Novomykhailivka, where fighting is taking place in the northeastern outskirts of Novomykhailivka, as the fields and forest lines here to the northeast are under attack by Russian forces and armored vehicles throughout the northern parts, as the Russians are attempting to expand the front line here in the direction of Novomykhailivka. As for the Marinka direction, we see that the Russians have made some small advancements to the north of the industrial parts of the city. We see here that they're moving through the forest line, and they get small advances that are slow as well, but they are advancing nonetheless through these fields. And the fighting here mainly is consisting of artillery battles, but there's also some fortifications here and there where the Russians are storming these trenches. Something that pro-Russians have always said to excuse the very slow advancements the Russians have been making since, well, summer 2022 all throughout today here in the start of 2024 is that the Russians are not aiming at capturing more territory. They're instead aiming at grinding down the Ukrainian army and destroying the army. That is something that was an official goal of the Russian army since the very start of the special military operation, as they call it, the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion. And that is something that has held true since then. We've had periods where the Russians were clearly aiming for territory. For example, the very start of the war, they wanted to capture these different parts. They've also annexed parts of territories, but it has never been their primary goal. And if you are one of those that denied it, that say this is just Russian cope, well, then we have this Ukrainian Minister of Defense, Deputy Minister of Defense, who is also coping, because she says the Russians' goal now is not a major offensive, but the depletion of the armed forces of Ukraine, says former Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Anna Meliar. Their goal now is to deplete us as much as possible so that we cannot create reserves of ammunition, cannot prepare equipment, and are mentally broken. They act in such a way that we do not have time to recover, she wrote in Telegram. At the same time, the Russians themselves save their personnel by using the tactics of assaults in small groups, which is similar to what the Ukrainians were doing in their summer offensive after their initial assaults failed. for which the Ukrainian armed forces are forced to spend a lot of shells. This again with the shell shortage, which is evident by the fact that the Ukrainians are only launching 2,000 shells a month, despite the whole front having battles. And during the Ukrainian summer offensive, they were launching 7,000, so they have more capabilities to launch more, but they do not have enough shells. At the same time, the Russian Federation began to form new formations. According to Melior, this is how the Russians are preparing for the next stage of hostilities. So essentially what she's saying is that the Russians are not yet ready for an offensive. Instead, their current operations are just to speed up the grinding down of the Ukrainian personnel and equipment, and at the same time to prevent the Ukrainians from building up a new army to launch a new offensive, and instead just continue this state of war of attrition until the Russians are either ready to launch a large offensive or that the Ukrainians have been grinded down so much that they simply collapse or fail to defend the front line. If the Ukrainians run out of equipment first / manpower, or if the Russians simply overwhelm the Ukrainians too much, that is when we will see a Russian offensive at the breaking point. And that is according to the former Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine. We will then move on to the direction of Peromayske, where the Russians have made some small advancements in the center of the town. We see that there's been continuous efforts by the Russians throughout the start of January, which were started out here in the northern parts, where the Russians flanked the Ukrainian positions from the north. Since then, the Ukrainians were forced to pull some troops back to deal with this. As such, the Russians took advantage of that and are continuing their advancements in the central parts. So we will see if the Ukrainians will now launch a counterattack to reestablish their positions, or they will remain on the defensive in this section. Because the Ukrainians are adapting the Russian tactic of active defense, so they are counterattacking whenever they see an opportunity. Other than that, they are remaining on the defense, which is why we've seen more success on the Ukrainian side since the start of January due to the adaptation of this tactic successfully. As for the north of Avdiivka, we see based on this geolocated footage here that the Russians have managed to advance a bit further and are now fighting within the forest patches here to the south of the water treatment plant, and they are as such bypassing the dacha area here to the east of the coke plant and are focusing on the eastern parts. Capturing these forest patches would allow them to then push on to the next one before flanking the Ukrainian positions in the dacha area and possibly storming it from the north. So we're seeing continuous efforts by the Russians in this section to make these small advancements and pressure the Ukrainian positions in this section of the front line. As for the Stepove direction, the Russians were fighting again here in the northern parts of the village. We are seeing this based on additional geolocated footage, which shows a T-90 tank fighting a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, and the T-90 was actually defeated. And this is mainly due to the Bradleys actually having anti-tank weaponry as well. So if the Bradley detects the tank first, it is able to deal with it despite being an infantry fighting vehicle. And this is why the ability to gather information and detect the opponent first is extremely important, because with the type of warfare we have right now, the armor and defenses is not comparable to the offensive powers. The anti-tank weaponry and the tank barrels pretty much penetrate anything the armor is capable of dealing with, and therefore if it's hit, it's pretty much destroyed, it's penetrated. As we have seen in multiple wars, even weaker weapons are able to penetrate the tanks and armored vehicles of stronger armies. Therefore, whoever detects the enemy first is able to deal with them quicker. So the drones has completely revolutionized this section of the battle, where they are able to detect units from the air with small cheap drones in large numbers. And as such, we're seeing that despite the Western software being superior to Russian software, they have been much better at detecting than what was expected prior to the war and at the start of the war. So we've seen a rapid development in this section by the Russians with the use of drones, but the Ukrainians also have drones and they have better software. For example, on the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, they have more information and better overview of the situation than Russian armored vehicles and tanks, especially older versions. We then move on to the Bakhmut direction, where there's been new attacks by Russian forces towards Ivanivske. It wasn't specified from what direction, but it's likely from the southeastern parts by the Dacha area, from the direction of Bakhmut itself, could also be from the northern parts where they are focusing on the final line of defense of the Ukrainians prior to Ivanivske, in between Bakhmut and Ivanivske. And it could also potentially be from the northern direction after the Russian advances here in the southwest of Hormove by the forest patches. So with this, we see that there is some attempts by the Russians towards Ivanivske, but the direction is not specified and there's been no geolocated information. As for the Avdiivka direction, there was this small advancement by the Russians here in the railways. And this is shown by this geolocated footage where we see the Russians being hit by Ukrainian FPV drones. And again, these drones are what is the main part of the battle right now. There's a lot of artillery, but the artillery is guided by the drones. There's armored vehicles, the armored vehicles are guided by the drones, and even infantry are guided by drones, and drones operate by themselves. Finally, we move further north in the direction of Terny before moving on to Sinkivka. We start out in this Terny direction here to the east of Terny, where the Ukrainians have been detected here in the forest patches, which shows that they still have positions here to the east. Based on this geolocated footage, we see that the Ukrainian positions here in these fortifications are still present, and as such, the Russian advancements either never happened or they were simply pushed back after Ukrainian counterattacks, as the Ukrainians received reinforcements in this section of the front line, and since then they have managed to stabilize the front line. So either the Russians need to reinforce their part of the front, or they pulled back to more fortified positions, or they were simply pushed back due to the overwhelming Ukrainian forces with the additional reinforcements. Either way, we see that there is continuous fighting, mainly based on artillery between the Russian and Ukrainian forces in this section of the front line. Finally, as for the Kupyansk direction, we see that the Russians continue attacking Sinkivka, mainly based on artillery. We also see continuous attempts by armored vehicles to provide fire support and infantry to storm their positions, but they've been unable to gain a foothold within the village. As for the Ukrainian forces, they've pushed here in the eastern direction of Kupyansk towards Pershut-Rafneve, where they've made these small advancements here, where they are trying to pressure the Russian forces and are trying to gain footholds in these forest lines and forest patches to pressure the Russian positions in the northern parts. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.